when a 74-year-old woman called Rose Docherty was pictured being handcuffed by police outside a hospital and taken away for just standing on the street with a placard.
Yeah.
And lots of people thought, what on earth is going on? And it shone the spotlight right back onto this law about abortion clinics.
You won't hear me say this very often about a BBC show, but this podcast was actually quite balanced on the buffer zone issue following the arrest of Rose Doherty. They had Lois McClatchy-Miller on from Alliance Defending Freedom. She was criticising the buffer zones and she did very well. But the really interesting bit I want to look at is where they had Green MSP Gillian Mackay, architect of the buffer zone law, speaking about it. Now, she refused to debate with Lois, which is quite understandable when you hear what she had to say coming up. But the key question under discussion was, what are you actually allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in a buffer zone? And it becomes quite clear that Gillian Mackay basically has got no idea.
Gillian Mackay, hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. The footage of Rose Doherty being arrested last week shocked a lot of people. It's been seen far and wide. I'm assuming you've seen it because you said after it, this kind of intimidation has no place in a modern or progressive Scotland. It could quite easily be argued, actually, the intimidation there came from the police, not from the 74-year-old woman in handcuffs, couldn't it?
It's very clear what you can and can't do in these zones and why they've set them up. We've had testimony the whole way through the bill process about how intimidating the presence of these people are with signs and with the various other activities we've seen outside of hospitals.
Now, that's stretching the definition of intimidation beyond any reasonable meaning. But that's the wrong part of the law. The relevant part of the law here is influencing.
Could she go back there? Could Rose Doherty go back there tomorrow without a placard and stand where she was standing?
So she could. What the consequences of that would be is not up to me. It's up to the police and the procurator. The procurator fiscal. The sign is not the thing that got her arrested. I'm sure, because we don't have a prescriptive list of behaviours within the Act.
So it's her law, as she likes to keep describing it, and she doesn't know. But this was being discussed in the committees, and again, this was the key question. And at the committees, they just fudged it, bypassed, they couldn't get a grip on it, and it was just left vague in the law. Now, she's saying here, it wasn't the placard that got Rose arrested. Really? Well, I was standing right next to Rose, so why wasn't I arrested? The police officer said to me, are you part of this? I said, no, I'm just filming, and that was fine. So if I had have had a placard, I obviously would have been arrested, but they didn't arrest me. So law needs to be clear, but the architect of the law can't clarify it herself.
But just to be clear, if this elderly lady went and stood on that piece of pavement tomorrow without holding a sign, without anything, just alone in her thoughts, she could be arrested. Again,
what you're asking me to do, Martin, is comment on hypotheticals.
It's entirely all of this is hypothetical, isn't it? That's what laws are.
But the application of them and the effect of that behaviour, the signs in themselves are not what people were worried about. It's one of the things that people did comment on during the passage of the bill. But the presence, the violation of that privacy, people being watched going to appointments is really intimidating and harassing too. For staff, that's cumulative.
I mean, that's absolutely right, of course. Laws are hypothetical. They say, if you do this, this is what will happen. You'll be punished for it. And citizens need to know. It's unfair to have a law that says, we've made something illegal, but we're not quite going to tell you what it is. You have to find out yourself, go and do a few things and see if you get arrested or not. You can't have a law like that. It'd be like saying, we've introduced a new speed limit on the road. And someone said, well, what is it? And they said, oh, we're not telling you. You have to go and try it out. Try driving at different speeds and, well, you'll just have to see what's happened. Now, again, the intimidation and harassment bit is totally irrelevant. That part of the law is just decoration. The key part of the law, the so-called crime that people actually will commit in buffer zones, will be the so-called crime of influencing. Now, you see Gillian Mackay, she just talks about people came to the Parliament and told us stories. It's as though she thinks there's some that mysterious process through which the stories that are told in the Parliament get distilled into the meaning of the law somehow. But it doesn't matter what stories were told in the Parliament. The important thing is, what does the law say?
But this wasn't an issue of people gathering. This was one person standing alone. And if you're saying that she can be arrested for standing in silent contemplative prayer, that is thought police territory, isn't it? That's kind of Orwellian.
She couldn't. Someone would have to find her behaviour intimidating or harassing to do that in the first place, and that'd be very difficult if she was just standing there silently in her own thoughts. Again,
the issue is influencing. Now, Gillian Mackay she's clearly contradicted herself. She said, Rose, yes, she would be arrested without a placard. Now she's saying, no, she wouldn't. This is the architect of the law. She doesn't understand it. What chance do you or I have?
Is this good law? Because this is down to be honest, a lot of this interpretation is down to the police who are called to the scene. And they have to interpret what is quite a vague law and decide what to do next. Sometimes presumably young, perhaps quite inexperienced officers dealing with a really sensitive, touchy issue. Could the law not be more specific to make it easier for everybody to understand, to make it clearer what's right and what's wrong, and to make it easier for the police to prosecute the law itself?
The law is very clear. It says you're not allowed to intimidate, harass, do any behaviour that would intimidate, harass, or otherwise influence someone's decision to provide or obtain an abortion. That's very specific, and the police have...
It's so up for discussion what constitutes intimidation or harassment, doesn't it? And they've got to interpret that. And if standing in silence constitutes that, it's really difficult to prove.
The police interpret intimidation every single day. It's part of their day-to-day role in various other offences, not just through this act. And they clearly, from the fact that we've had an arrest, haven't found it that difficult to be able to interpret what is right and what is wrong under the legislation.
Now, the police do indeed recognise intimidation and harassment, yes, but as I keep saying, they're not the important part of the law. They're already illegal. The key part of the law is influence. And Gillian Mackay's argument, the law must be clear because, look, the police have arrested someone. Dear, oh dear.
There was a case of a woman in Birmingham who was standing in a street in a similar situation, and the police came to her, and she wasn't doing anything. She didn't have a placard. She was standing on her own, and they said to her, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm standing here." And they said, "Are you praying?" And she said, "I might be, inside my head." And then they said, "You're under arrest." That could happen here, could it?
I doubt it could happen here. People would have to be very explicit about the reason that they were...
It could happen to Rose Docherty tomorrow. You just told me that.
People would have to be very explicit about their reason for why they're there. That's why I mentioned the performative element.
So Gillian Mackay is just absolutely all over the place. She just doesn't know. Now, she says they must be very explicit about the reason they're there. That makes it sound like a thought crime. But she just said Rose Docherty could be arrested with no placard. But yeah, so it would depend on asking her, why are you there? So it's what's going on in people's head that actually determines whether it's a crime or not. But you've just got to think from this, from Gillian Mackay, it's just incompetence. She hasn't thought this through. She doesn't understand it. She hasn't created clear legislation.
What about the accusation that even private prayer within your own home could amount to breaking the law? I mean, it's stretching it, but it's not wrong, is it?
It's absolute nonsense.
Is it? I'm looking at a letter that the government sent to householders.
Nowhere in it does it say private prayer.
No, but what it does say is that the activities in a private place like a house in these zones could be an offence if they can be seen or heard within the zone and are done intentionally or recklessly. Now, if you're telling me that prayer can be an offence outside a clinic, if you're inside your own house in that zone, theoretically, the law could be applied to you, couldn't it? I'm just trying to work out if there's any way in which J.D. Vance could be right.
I should be really clear. Praying in of itself is not an offence under this bill. We are not banning prayer under the Act.
Performative prayer. If you're standing at a window with your hands together in front of your face in that classic kind of, that classic image of prayer, if you're standing at a window so people can see you, then could it be interpreted as an offence?
That then depends on who's passing the window and whether anybody can...
So he's not wrong, is he, J.D. Vance?
No,
he's not wrong.
He is wrong because if I don't know anyone that can pray loudly or performatively enough to be seen from outside their own house. I don't know anyone that can see into what's going on in someone's living room.
I mean, to be honest, this is just getting laughable now, isn't it? It says she doesn't know anyone who can pray loud enough to be seen outside their own house. I mean, dear oh dear, that's utterly ridiculous. To be seen praying through a window, I mean, that's not really very difficult. Then says she doesn't know anyone who can see into someone's living room. I mean, that windows are transparent. You can walk past the house and you can see through the window and see what people are doing inside. And she says it depends on who's passing the window. No, it doesn't. If you're trying to influence, if you're doing the thing that will be illegal in the street and people can see it through your window, then that would be the crime. Doesn't matter who in particular is walking past. So was J.D. Vance right on this point? On this particular point, he was right. I mean, it is far-fetched. It's difficult to imagine this would ever happen, but technically it could happen.
Right. What is clear is that these people can do what they like within reason, 201 metres away from a clinic. They say they plan to. One group in Glasgow says they plan to hold a series of vigils soon. They've told us that today. I mean, are you happy with that? Is that like everyone wins in this situation? Is that what this was designed for?
I think that's still too close for me, to be honest. I don't understand why people want to go and try and intervene in other people's private medical affairs.
Well, Gillian Mackay is very clear there, isn't she? The buffer zones have been set at 200 metres. The law does specify that they can be extended indefinitely at the request of hospitals or whoever else. And so you can expect extensions are going to be on their way. So the group in Glasgow, as they did in Edinburgh, are going to set up outside the buffer zone. But there's a fairly good chance, I think, the buffer zone will be extended to just push them further and further and further away. Now, Gillian Mackay there says she just doesn't understand why these pro-life activists want to be at the abortion clinics. Now, it's one thing to disagree with people. It's another thing to say you don't understand what they want to do. Now, Gillian Mackay has heard pro-life people, she's heard people who've taken part in the vigils explaining their rationale for being there, which includes the possibility of influencing a decision, changing someone's mind, saving a life, saving the life of a child that might otherwise have been aborted. And Gillian Mackay just says she doesn't understand that reason. She should understand it. She might disagree with it, but she should at the very least understand it. So to conclude, Gillian Mackay is qualified to be an MSP in the sense that she got enough votes and she was put up as a candidate by the Green Party to become an MSP. But it's plainly apparent she's not competent to make law. It's also sobering to remember that there was only one MSP who looked at this legislation and thought, no, I'm going to vote against that. MSP should have voted against it in principle, but also because it's just so badly drafted. When I watched the committee meetings in the Parliament when they were discussing this key question, someone's standing there apparently not doing anything. Doesn't matter whether they're praying in their head or not, just someone standing there, no placard, just standing there. Is that illegal or not? Key question, absolutely key question that needs pinning down in the legislation. But in the committees, they just didn't do it. The discussion didn't focus and didn't actually come to a conclusion. They're really happy listening to stories. That's what they're like. But when it comes to actually pinning down exactly what the law means, well, that doesn't go quite so well. Now, I said the BBC were very balanced in this little podcast, and they were. But I suppose it's maybe worth making the point that before this legislation was passed, the BBC were not balanced in any way, shape or form. They were cheerleaders for the legislation. So perhaps a cynical person could say, the BBC, make sure the law gets passed. And once it's passed, then okay, you can become balanced because, well, it doesn't matter then, does it? The deed is done. Maybe that's too cynical, but in any case, the BBC podcast was actually good and it was balanced. So well done to Rose Docherty again, because what she's done here through her arrest is she's exposed the reality of the vigils, what goes on there, and of the nature of the law. Now, what sort of support has Rose received? Well, massive support. Tens of thousands of people expressing support online in Scotland, in the UK, and around the world. Not from the Reform Party, of course. I obviously have to keep pointing out they're not interested. They've got nothing to say on the matter. And wouldn't it be wonderful if there was a whole succession of churches and denominations, church groupings, coming out and making statements saying that they're appalled at what's happened, this law is totally wrong, and they're very much supportive of Rose and her pro-life work. Wouldn't that be fantastic? But I haven't seen much of that at all. There will be some church leaders who will speak out, but generally they will be silent. The pro-life groups around the UK and around Scotland have been very vocal in their support of Rose and their opposition to the buffer zone legislation. But also a lot of people who are free speech activists have also been very supportive. And I think we've got a situation here where we've got a Christian following basically a calling in line with Christian teaching, and most of the support, or a very large amount of the support for her, comes from freedom of speech advocates rather than from the church, which I would say should be a bit of a challenge to the church. Anyway, I hope that was interesting. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye.